You know what? I used to think somewhere out there successful people had figured out something the rest of us hadn't. Like there was some hidden knowledge passed down in quiet rooms, some formula locked away where ordinary folks couldn't find it. I'd look at people who they were winning at life and wonder, what do they know that I don't? What's the secret they're not telling me? But here's what I discovered. After years of searching, after reading hundreds of books, after sitting with successful people and studying their lives, there are no secrets. None the people you admire. The ones building wealth. The ones with great families. The ones living the life you dream about. They're not holding back information. They're not hiding anything from you. They're simply doing things you're not willing to do yet. Jim Rohn said it. Best success is neither magical nor mysterious. Success is the natural consequence of consistently applying basic fundamentals. Think about that basic fundamentals. Not advanced secrets, not hidden knowledge. Basic things that everyone knows but very few people do. See, the great lie of our time is that success is complicated, that it requires special connections or lucky breaks or being in the right place at the right time. And that lie serves a purpose. It lets you off the hook. If success is mysterious, if it's about luck or secrets, then you're not responsible for not having it. Yet you can keep waiting, keep searching, keep hoping that one day you'll stumble onto the answer. But what if the answer's been staring you in the face all along? What if everything you need to know about success is already available to you right now? The real question isn't what's the secret. The real question is, are you willing to do what needs to be done day after day, week after flash? Week, year after year, when nobody's watching, when nobody's cheering, when the results aren't showing up yet. That's what separates winners from everyone else. Not secret knowledge, but consistent action. Not hidden formulas, but daily disciplines. Not magic, but method. Let me break this down for you, because once you understand this, your whole approach to life changes. The fundamentals are simple but not easy. Jim Rohn taught that success is a few simple disciplines practiced every day, while failure is simply a few errors in judgment repeated every day. Think about how profound that is. Your life right now is the sum total of your daily decisions. The small choices you make when nobody's looking. Want to be healthy? The formula isn't a secret. Eat nutritious food, exercise regularly, get enough sleep. Everyone knows this, but how many people do it consistently? Want to build wealth? The formula isn't hidden. Spend less than you earn. Invest the difference. Avoid bad debt. Be patient. Everyone knows this too. But how many people actually follow it? Want better relationships? Communicate honestly. Listen more than you talk. Show up when it's inconvenient. Forgive quickly. Love consistently. Again, not secret knowledge, just uncommon application. The problem is we want shortcuts. We want the results without the process. We want the harvest without planting the seeds, without watering them, without pulling the weeds, without waiting for the seasons to turn. But that's not how life works. Jim Rohn said, don't wish it were easier. Wish you were better. Don't wish for less problems. Wish for more skills. Don't wish for less challenge. Wish for more wisdom. That's the mindset shift that changes everything. Stop looking for an easier path. Start becoming someone capable of walking the difficult one. You become what you repeatedly do. Here's something most people miss. Success isn't about one big decision. It's about 1,000 small ones. It's not the dramatic moments that define your life. It's the mundane ones, the daily routines. Nobody sees the habits you build when you're alone, the standards you keep when it would be easier to let them slip. Jim Rohn taught that your level of success will rarely exceed your level of personal development, because success is something you attract by the person you become, not something you pursue. Read that again. Success is something you attract by the person you become. Most people are trying to get more without becoming more. They want a better job without developing better skills. They want more money without becoming more valuable. They want better relationships without becoming a better person. Doesn't work that way. The marketplace rewards value. If you're not earning what you want to earn, it's because you're not bringing enough value to the marketplace yet. Notice, I said yet. Because value can be developed, skills can be learned. You can become more valuable starting today, but it requires work on yourself. Jim Rohn's most famous advice: work harder on yourself than you do on your job. If you work hard on your job, you can make a living. If you work hard on yourself, you can make a fortune. This is the secret everyone's looking for, except it's not a secret. It's a principle that's been taught for thousands of years. So how do you work on yourself? You read books, you listen to educational content, you study people who've achieved what you want to achieve, you develop new skills, you challenge your old thinking, you push yourself beyond your comfort zone, you face your fears, you build discipline, you create better habits. None of this is complicated, but all of it is difficult because it requires you to change. And human beings resist change, even when that change would improve their lives. We'd rather stay comfortable and complain about our results, get uncomfortable and transform ourselves. The power of daily disciplines. Let me tell you about the slight edge. It's a concept that changed my life every day. You make choices that are either taking you toward your goals or away from them. And here's the thing. These choices are easy to do, and they're also easy not to do. Reading 10 pages of a good book, easy to do, also easy not to do. Skipping it one day won't hurt you, but skip it every day for a year, and you've missed out on reading 12 to 15 books that could have changed your thinking. Going for a 30-minute walk, easy to do, also easy not to do. Skip it today, and nothing bad happens, but skip it every day for 10 years, and you've created a health crisis. Saving 10% of your income, easy to do, also easy not to do. Spend it all today, and you're fine. But spend it all every day for 20 years, and you've created financial stress. Jim Rohn said, failure is not a single cataclysmic event. You don't fail overnight. Failure is the inevitable result of an accumulation of poor thinking and poor choices. When you dismiss the value of small decisions, you're dismissing the power of daily disciplines. But here's the flip side. Success is also the result of small decisions made consistently over time. You don't become successful in a day, but make the right choices every day, and success becomes inevitable. It's mathematics. It's compound interest applied to your life. The winners understand this. They don't rely on motivation or inspiration to do the right thing. They build systems. They create routines. They establish daily disciplines that ensure the important things get done, whether they feel like it or not. That's the real difference between successful people and everyone else. Successful people do what unsuccessful people are unwilling to do. They do it when they don't feel like it. They do it when it's inconvenient. They do it when nobody's watching. They do it because they understand that small disciplines, repeated with consistency, create extraordinary results. You are the average of your associations. Jim Rohn taught that you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. This is one of the most important principles of success, and it's one most people ignore. Your associations will shape your thinking, your expectations, your standards, your results, your destiny. Look at your 5 closest friends. What's their average income? What are their habits? What do they talk about? What are their goals? What are their standards? Because whether you realize it or not, you're becoming more like them every day. If you're surrounded by people who complain, who make excuses, who settle for mediocrity, who have given up on their dreams, their influence will pull you down. You'll start to adopt their thinking, their language, their limitations, their results. But if you surround yourself with people who are growing, who set high standards, who take responsibility, who are building something, who refuse to settle, their influence will lift you up. You'll rise to meet their expectations. You'll adopt their habits, their mindset, their level of achievement. Now, this doesn't mean you abandon everyone who isn't where you want to be, but it does mean you need to be intentional about your associations. You need to actively seek out people who are ahead of you, who will challenge you to grow, who will hold you to a higher standard. Jim Rohn said, don't join an easy crowd. You won't grow. Go where the expectations and the demands to perform are high. If you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. If you're the most successful person in your circle, you need a new circle. This might be uncomfortable. It might mean limiting your time with certain people. It might mean seeking out mentors or joining new groups or investing in masterminds. But your growth depends on it. Your future depends on it. Success leaves clues, and one of the biggest clues is the quality of associations. Successful people maintain the discipline of consistency beats talent. I want to talk about something that levels the playing field: consistency. You don't have to be the most talented person. You don't have to be the smartest or the fastest or the best connected. You just have to be the most consistent. Rohn said, "Success is neither magical nor mysterious. Success is the natural consequence of consistently applying basic fundamentals." That word, consistently, is the key. Anyone can do the right thing. Once anyone can have a good day or a good week. But can you do it for a year? Can you do it for 5 years? Can you do it when it's hard? When nobody's watching? When the results aren't showing up yet? Most people start strong. They set big goals, they're excited, they're motivated. They go all in for a week, maybe a month. But then life happens, they get tired. The excitement fades, the results take longer than expected, and they quit. They tell themselves it wasn't meant to be, or maybe this isn't for me, or I'll try something else. But the winners, they understand that success is a marathon, not a sprint. They know that showing up every day, even when progress is slow, is what separates achievers from dreamers. They don't need constant motivation because they've built discipline. They don't rely on feeling good. They rely on doing good. Rohn taught we must all suffer from one of two pains: the pain of discipline or the pain of regret. The difference is, discipline weighs ounces, while regret weighs tons. You choose which pain you want to experience. Do you want the discomfort of doing what you don't feel like doing? Or do you want the anguish of looking back and wishing you had? The pain of discipline is temporary. It's the early morning when you don't want to get up. It's the workout when your body says quit. It's the sales call when you're afraid of rejection. It's the hour of study when you'd rather watch TV. But that pain passes, and it leaves behind strength, character, results. The pain of regret never goes away. It sits with you for years, decades, even a lifetime, wondering, what if? What if I had tried harder? What if I hadn't given up? What if I had been more consistent? That's the pain nobody wants, but it's the pain most people choose because they're not willing to pay the price of discipline. Build your personal framework. Now, let's get practical. How do you actually apply all of this? You start by building a personal framework, a system that keeps you on track, even when you don't feel like it, because motivation comes and goes, but your system should be consistent. First, protect your morning. The way you start your day determines how the rest of your day goes. Rohn said, either you run the day or the day runs. You don't let the world set your agenda. Don't check your phone first thing. Don't jump into problems and emails before you've taken care of yourself. Start your day with a routine that centers you. Read something positive. Review your goals. Exercise, pray, or meditate. Plan your day. Do something that puts you in a peak state before the chaos begins. This sets the tone for everything that follows. Second, track your progress. What gets measured gets improved at the end of each day. Spend 5 minutes reviewing. Did you do what you said you'd do? Where did you win? Where did you fall short? No judgment, just awareness, because awareness is the first step to change. Third, set weekly goals. Not just annual or monthly ones. Break your big goals into weekly targets. Then every Sunday, review your week and plan the next one. This keeps you focused, it prevents drift, it ensures that every week you're taking steps toward your biggest goals. Fourth, schedule your priorities. Don't just write down what you want to accomplish. Put it on your calendar. If it's not scheduled, it won't happen. Life will fill up your time with whatever comes up, unless you proactively block time for what matters most. Rohn said, success is nothing more than a few simple disciplines practiced every day. Your framework is what ensures those disciplines actually happen. It removes the guesswork. It eliminates the daily negotiation with yourself. You've practiced every day, already decided what you're going to do. Now you just Do it. Stop searching and start building. Here's what I want you to understand. Deeply success isn't hiding from you. It's not locked away in some secret vault. It's not reserved for special people who know something you don't. Success is available to anyone willing to do the work, to build the habits, to stay consistent, to become more. Jim Rohn spent his entire life teaching these principles, not because they were secrets, but because they were fundamentals that most people ignore. He said the same wind blows on us all. The difference in arrival is not the blowing of the wind, but the set of the sail. You can't control the economy, the weather, your background, where you were born, what opportunities came your way, but you can control your habits, your disciplines, your associations, your daily choices, your commitment to growth. That's your sail. And when you set it right, the same winds that blow everyone else backward will carry you forward. So, stop waiting for someone to hand you the answers. Stop searching for the magic formula. Start building your life with intention. Start applying the fundamentals you already know. Start reading. Start learning. Start taking better care of your body. Start managing your money wisely. Start showing up consistently. The secret, if you must call it that, is that there are no secrets, only principles. And those principles work for anyone who works them. Success is predictable. It's the result of doing certain things in a certain way over and over again until the results compound. Jim Rohn's final lesson is this: don't wish it were easier. Wish you were better. Because when you get better, everything gets better. Your income gets better. Your relationships get better. Your health gets better. Your future gets better. So, make the decision today. Stop searching for secrets and start building a life based on fundamentals. The fundamentals work. They've always worked. They'll always work. The only question is, will you work them? Your future is waiting. Go build it.